Peace Families. This is Davon Love, Director of Public Policy Leaders of Beautiful Struggle. And we have with us a mentor of mine, somebody who is really important to Black Baltimore political life. This is Senator Joe Carter. Thank you for being on with us in our In Search of Black Power podcast.
Thanks for having me. Finally, we made this.
Yeah. So, it's a lot I want to talk to you about. It's a bunch of stuff I've been wanting us to talk about on camera because it needs to be, on record. So we're going to go through a lot of stuff. Before we jump into that, though, if you just talk about your career as a legislator, just some of the stuff that you worked on, just kind of general introduction stuff.
Sure. So, as you know, I just won re-election to the Senate in my
Maryland.
second term, Senate of Maryland, and so I'll be going into my second term. The first term, we can talk a little bit about the issues there, but prior to that, I had been in the House of Delegates for 3.5 terms, and I had resigned in 2016, only to wind up running for the Senate in 2018. When I resigned from the House of Delegates, I thought that my political career was over, and I wanted it to be over. I had not had a very pleasant experience in the House of Delegates or in Maryland politics. And it was so depleting to my soul that I just didn't want to ever be involved in politics again, which is interesting because I get so angry when I meet people and they say, "Oh, I don't get involved in politics," right? But that's a little different. For me, it was just, constantly like feeling like I was banging my head against a brick wall, and the only thing was happening is that my head was getting bruised and I was getting concussions, but I wasn't getting anything accomplished. And then before that, of course, and still, I'm a lawyer. I practice mainly criminal defense law, and I'm a lifelong resident of Baltimore. Mm-hmm. My mom was a school teacher after the death of my father. First, she was a housewife and mother, and then my dad abruptly died in 1971, and she went to teach. My dad was known civil rights activist Walter P. Carter.
So, say a little bit more about some of the issues you took up when you were in the House of Delegates. Because I think, just so people are clear, I think a lot of people, around Baltimore, around the state, know about some of your work. There's this emergence of like criminal justice reform being a thing. But you led on a lot of that stuff before it was popular. If you want to just say, a little bit of some of the issues you worked on, while you were in the House of Delegates.
So when I first got elected, it was 2003. And I can tell you that I went in there just taking my experience I was not as much of a seasoned attorney, but I'd been a criminal defense attorney for a number of years. And so one of the issues I knew that was critically important just from my work outside of the legislature was the idea of expungement of records. And as you know, here we are. That was 2003. Mm-hmm. We're in next session will be 2023, a full 20 years, and we are still working on issues of expungement. Mm-hmm. And so I had a couple of bills to start out with, which was to be able to expunge non-convictions, be able to expunge a record if you're charged with multiple crimes but convicted of only one. Then you were unable, and still in many respects unable, to expunge the whole record that outside of your one convicted charge. And then another one was this thing that we did pass eventually in my final year in the House of Delegates, 2016. We eventually passed the subsequent conviction rule, the rule that said that the Maryland law that said that required prohibited you from being able to expunge any conviction if you'd had a conviction that you failed to expunge, and it was expungible, but you got anything later than that, then you were then forever foreclosed from expunging that. And so I started out with those two bills in 2003 when I first was elected, not with any advocacy groups, not with any provocation, just because I knew they were I couldn't understand how somebody could be charged with a crime, not convicted of a crime, and then still have it on their record. So that was just, to me, a common sense thing. Mm-hmm. But think about this. Common sense, I thought. Now, with 20 years later, multiple advocacy groups collaborating on trying to get that done, and we still don't completely have unit of charges fixed in terms of being able to make sure people can expunge everything except the convicted charge. So that one example shows you how slow the Maryland legislature has been to move on things that some of us think are common sense things. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to the lives, particularly of Black people who are overrepresented in the criminal justice system because of over arrest and over prosecution and all of that, overcharging, we're harmed the most. And those issues where we are harmed the most tend to be the issues that Maryland is slowest to move on. So then, subsequent to that, there was O'Malley with the illegal arrest, and I had a bill to have automatic expungement of any arrest that doesn't result in charges, and there was a big to-do about it. They killed the bill, vilified me, and then handed it to another delegate who had nothing to do with the issue to pass the following year. And they only killed it simply, I think, because they just didn't want me to have that. And I'll tell you, what I felt that was, O'Malley was right when around 2006 or 7 when O'Malley was running for governor, and they felt that this was they mischaracterized, first of all, always my intent, but also looked at this as harmful to him in his quest for governor. So I wasn't allowed to pass a bill that was a massive human rights violation, a fix. It wasn't even a fix. It was, to repair some of the damage caused by it. Wasn't even allowed to pass that because of the political aspirations of Martin O'Malley, a white man from Montgomery County who came to Baltimore and became the mayor.
So we're going to delve deep into that. Before we do, if you can talk a little, one of the things that I find, kind of as I have come up through the ranks in terms of like young folks engaged in political activism, I find there to just be a woeful lack of attention paid to some of the history, like the history of black folks engaged in challenging racism and white supremacy at a level of policy in Baltimore. And I know two people who I know have influenced you in your work. You mentioned your father, Walter P. Carter, who's tremendously influential in some of the history on advocacy on police accountability. He was in the center of, when you look back at the archives of newspaper editorials, and someone like Parent Mitchell, and I know that they both at different points headed up the Community Action Agency, here in Baltimore, and both, tremendous in, how they conducted it. So if you could just talk, a little bit about just the impact that them and others have had on you in terms of your political worldview and activity.
So I think Parent Mitchell, Walter Carter, and a number of the people that were active in either civil rights and or politics or just any kind of black leadership when I was growing up had a tremendous influence on me. In fact, they are the driving force behind why I do anything, not just politics, but the desire for black people in Baltimore to realize our power potential, our economic potential, and have equal treatment has been really a quest of my life because it's what I was born into. When I was born and was growing up, you had people like my dad and Perrin and so many other people that had dedicated their lives to that mission. And so, of course, when my dad died when I was very young, I just naturally assumed as a kid, well, then I must be here to carry that on because he's not here to do it anymore. And so it just that's the way I interpreted his death. And that's the way that I've kind of conducted my life. And I'm sure it's driven me to, one, become a lawyer. And then I just did that thinking that was a chance to fight in a system for justice. But then when the opportunity to run for the House of Delegates came up, I thought, oh, well, maybe this is a chance to shape policy in a way that will be able to impact our lives. And so my aspirations politically are completely driven by my desire to, my being born into a black liberation movement and having no greater desire in life than to realize that in Baltimore City.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about, one of the things that I feel like I've learned from both all the stories you told me, from observing you, is just the very sophisticated and particular ways the Democratic Party operates in undermining that struggle for black liberation. And as you know, the challenge with that is, we're a captured electorate. Black people, we're Democrats because that's the place where we're the most viable. But as a result of that, I don't think, and I would, feel like I can assume that for you, the Democrats don't deliver for black people to the extent that we provide them patronage and support as an institution. And in fact, efforts to seize power when it comes to black folks, or to really do justice by black folks, are undermined. So I want to break this up into two questions I want you to reflect on. One is, as you mentioned, Martin O'Malley, being a white guy, comes to a majority black city, able to become mayor and then governor. And just the way in which the Democratic Party took so much interest in making him a thing.
Sure.
So if you can reflect, and then we'll start with this. If you can reflect on your sense of the damage that's done to black people and the way that the level of congealing that the Democratic Party did to Martin O'Malley's rise, in your sense, how does that provide an example to us, the kind of anti-black and racist nature of the Democratic Party?
Well, Davon, I am still in the Senate of Maryland, and so even talking about these issues now possibly has a detrimental effect on me because I believe that there is a desire still to evade the truth about our reality as black people with the Democratic Party. And, a part of why we're in the situation we are in is because of black people's conditioning that if you want to participate in a system, then you have a choice. You have a choice to be a Democrat or a Republican, and so that's why we so largely are Democrats. I was raised by my mom to be a Democrat because, there was only one choice, and she thought that the Democrats were the progressive people that were more interested in inclusion of black people and policy interests that were beneficial to us, and that the Republicans were not. And so there was no choice growing up. We always participated in politics on a local level. I have a lot of predecessors and mentors that were in Baltimore politics, like Iris Reeves and Vera Hall, who were also my mom's best friends and also adopted aunts. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that this party must be good because everybody that I knew was in it. And I'm talking later on after the death of my dad, who was much more of a revolutionary. And so I just followed along and supported candidates and always voted since the age of 18 and always participated in campaigns. But I was always looking for that Parent Mitchell again. I was always looking for that person that was really for the people, who had a black people's agenda at heart. And I didn't really find it. But, I get elected and I'm astounded because this party that I've been brought up to believe is supportive of our people is so hostile to me. And I couldn't understand it. I just absolutely could not understand it. Mm-hmm. And in large part, it was because the dynamic at the time was, and it wasn't, I want to be clear, it was Martin O'Malley's, the desire to embrace him and bring up and create a false narrative that he was somehow exceptional when he was very mediocre as a person, as a lawyer, as a politician. Like, there's nothing outstanding in his entire resume, in his entire career, really, but for the Democrats to be like, oh, we want to lift this man up, make him mayor of Baltimore, governor of Maryland, and ultimately president of the United States. It's kind of absurd, really. Mm-hmm. If you ever had a conversation with him, you're clear that there's nothing very exceptional about him intellectually, in terms of vision, progressively, nothing. So, but there was this desire, and I think that perhaps it was because he was a white man, and because he didn't have because he got elected in Baltimore by an agenda that frankly resulted in the oppression of black people. And so I think that he was looked at as such a rising star and such a phenomenon because he's not from Baltimore, he's white, he comes to a majority black city, and he's able to get elected as mayor, and his agenda is to lock up black people. Mm-hmm. And he does that successfully.
And you were in the center of the advocacy to address this mass arrest policy. So if you want to speak to just I imagine that was something that upset the efforts to make him a thing.
I think the Democratic Party was not going to allow that to upset the efforts. And so, so back then, I just remember I was newly elected. I didn't come in with an agenda to deal with illegal arrest or any of those issues. I didn't necessarily have an agenda. I sort of thought it might be minority business inclusion because that's who I've been working with the minority business associations and Robert Clay and all. And so I get there. I'm newly elected about a year in, I think, if that. And I get a call from a good friend of mine who's now passed away, Byron Franklin, who tells me he's been arrested in Baltimore and for nothing. And I've already been hearing this from my clients a lot. But, everybody says they're arrested for nothing.
Right.
So I didn't make a big deal about it.
Right.
Like, what did you do? So I'm like, what did you do? And he's like, I didn't do anything. I'm like, well, what did the police say you did?
Right.
And he's like, they didn't say anything because I didn't get any charge papers. And he was held for an entire weekend. And he was a lawyer, a guy that went to law school with me, and I believed him. And so I was like, how? At first I didn't. I thought it was incredulous. Like, how in the world could you be arrested on a Friday, released on a Monday, and you have no charges? That's absurd. And so I started putting out feelers, and I even put out a petition, and I even put out an ad on the radio. And you might ask, why would you do that? Well, because I began to be clear it was really common. And I needed to get the information about how often it was happening. And so, because I could get no attention, even then, like the Baltimore Sun, I could get no attention from them, the Afro either. So I didn't have any way to communicate to people. We didn't have social media. We didn't have Facebook then.
Right.
And so I paid out of my own personal money to go on the radio and ask people if they've been arrested or know of anybody being arrested falsely, illegal arrest in Baltimore. And I remember that I put my script in for what my ad was going to say that I was paying for to WBAL. No, not WOLB, I'm sorry, WOLB. And it said that I believe that Martin O'Malley was responsible for policies of illegal arrest, and if this has happened to you, blah, blah, blah. And literally, I'm paying for my own ad on an alleged black-owned radio station, and they tell me I can't use the words illegal arrest, even though I'm telling them I'm talking about illegal arrest, and I cannot use the words Martin O'Malley in my ad. So I just turned it into arrest without charges if you've been arrested without charges. So long story short, that wasn't, I don't believe, just a radio decision. That was we had a strong leadership decision then. Martin O'Malley had a lot of power, a lot of control. You had a Senate president who was completely in line with him. You had a House Speaker completely in line with him. Every member of the city council completely in line with him. Every single member of the state delegation in Annapolis completely in line with him. And our congressional delegation. So everybody in this political system is in support of what O'Malley is doing. And even when given the data and the information, they're inclined to not believe it or do the Bill Clinton thing. Well, this is what they said they wanted. This is what the people said they wanted. No, people never said that they wanted families and communities destroyed, people arrested for nothing. They said that they wanted crime cut. They wanted to feel safe in their neighborhoods. They didn't say we want to feel safe from the drug dealers, but we don't want to be safe from the police, right? So it was just a massive of miscommunication and falsehood to create this continue this narrative and to keep O'Malley in power and to keep the policies going on, which happened for the entirety of his terms as mayor. From 1999 to 2006, you know this, I've said this a million times, 750,000 arrests, no less than 1/3 to 1/2 completely illegal arrest, and another portion of those, what I would call unnecessary arrest. Arrests that are, maybe there was a legal justification for the arrest, but it's abated by the fact that you've served 45 days in sentence for urination, right? So all of these false arrests.
And this is between 1999 and 2006, the 750,000 arrests.
Yeah. So, and I put this recently on Facebook for some reason, and someone said, that's impossible. And I went back and found an old article that finally at the end of it, there was an article that talked about it. And it was talking about how during that time, it wasn't having a massive impact on cutting down violent crime or homicide. And the reason it wasn't is because you were locking up the wrong people. Basically, you're locking up all of black society and not the people that are committing the crimes.
So if you could say a little bit about, because you were saying that, because of the strong leadership structure that wanted O'Malley in power, we're talking about the Democratic Party establishment. How would you describe the way that other black people who might characterize themselves as champions of black people, how would you characterize how they postured themselves in the midst of this mass arrest policy that was happening?
Well, I mean, for the most part, they took sides with the Democrat establishment, perpetuated the narrative, and then were very comfortable furthering a view that the claims I was making, even though they were substantiated by the data, were wrong. And, at a certain point, even with the NAACP and the ACLU getting involved, which, I had a hand in because I was at the time chair of the Legal Redress Committee for the NAACP, and I didn't want to see the ACLU take on an issue that impacted black people without having a black organization as part of it. And so that was a conversation that we had that started that entire collaboration. And so I would just say that, for many of those years, I'll just say that, it's a good thing that I grew up in Baltimore City public schools and had a lot of criticism from some of my peers. It's a good thing that I went to Loyola College, which was a very, very racist school in the 80s. There were very few black women there, and I felt very alone and isolated there. And so it's a good thing that I had those experiences as a precursor to what I was going to go through as a member of the House of Delegates. I mean, basically, I just never felt like I was never made to feel like I had a right to be there. And I was never made to feel like I had a right to speak. I had a right to have an opinion. I didn't have a right to pass bills. I didn't have a right to do anything. And so the impact that it had on me at the time was I just decided I'm not going to take on battles I can't win. I'm going to just take on things that I'm going to stick to what I know is right, and I'll stick in this narrow scope of where I feel like I have expertise. They're not going to let me really branch out into anything else or keep me in a box. So I just continued to kind of plow away on those issues. And so over that time, that's when you saw me take on the efforts at police reform, some criminal justice reform, some juvenile justice reform, all of these things that, they're non-starters then, that are now slowly but surely becoming laws over the last number of years. But I also, when I think back to those early years when I was in the House of Delegates, again, I'm a person who believes I don't like doing anything that doesn't have a purpose. So I didn't want to just be there or put in bills that had no purpose. So I spent time figuring out what is needed here. And I can think of two bills that we're, talking about now that have happened. One of them was a no-brainer to get the lead out of the water in the public schools. There was a whole court case that had happened. They shut the water off. They admitted that it was lead infested, and I thought, no brainer, get the lead out of the water. Well, I wasn't supported by anybody in the Baltimore delegation. There was a whole major, we don't have time for the whole story, just so many shenanigans put forth to destroy the bill, right? Insanity. And then I remember another bill that I had when I first gone in. Listen to this. And this is all documented. You can look up the old records and see this. With no advocacy groups, no provocation from anyone, just I didn't understand why we weren't letting people who had served their sentences not be able to vote, right? Why didn't we let people with convicted felonies be able to vote? So I put in the bill to do that, and it was largely stomped down, shot down. Who do you think you are coming in here trying to do this? I'm talking about by Democrat leadership, black people, and some from Baltimore. I remember I had a bill, too, this is in the first year or two, to deal with predatory lending and the housing foreclosure, a precursor to what we saw later with the foreclosure crisis. And again, it was all this who do you think you are? And this was said to me. I'm not saying this was implied. No, who do you think you are? Coming in here, putting in bills to do what we've already addressed or what we're already working on. we're working on this. You don't have any business interfering in legislative business, right?
And you're a legislator.
It's pretty much what I was told. And I'm talking about black leadership now. And so, some of these things, I just let it go. You dealing with it, I'm going to let you have it. I ain't going to mess with it no more. And I didn't. I just stuck again with like my criminal justice stuff or stuff I thought nobody else is really touching. And lo and behold, what happens? We get that whole foreclosure crisis some years later. I feel like my bills I was trying to do would have put a dent in that, would have stopped some of what happened. We later on get, in a couple of terms later, we get then Delegate Corey McCray comes in and all these advocacy groups and unions and all we got to get the felons not right to vote. And they all this embrace that, and he gets that done, and he's a big hero for that. Not taking anything away from it. It was the right thing to do. But it's just different time, different leaders, and also, different players. Like, I feel, and I don't have I don't have any resentment or any envy of anyone, because I know that, my journey is my journey, and this is what I'm supposed to have experienced, kind of think Maya Angelou said, wouldn't take nothing from my journey now. So I don't have those feelings, but I'm doesn't stop me from being keenly aware of the difference between how I was treated and how someone like that was treated, or many other of my colleagues now.
Right.
So, and even the lead in the water, same thing, same thing. And think about it though, what bothers me, I don't care, that someone else did it later and got credit. I care that from the time it was proposed until they ultimately did it, you had people who didn't start the kindergarten, went all the way through the 12th grade with freaking lead-infested water. That's the problem.
So I think, as you alluded to, I think most people would agree. I mean, you're the most left progressive legislator in the state of Maryland. And we're seeing now, the emergence of the popularization, a lot of the stuff that you worked on before. What are some of the lessons that you would draw from both your experience, both in terms of the policies and kind of how you were treated, and given this moment now where some of the stuff is more popular? I'm sure there are, and we've discussed like new approaches and techniques of obfuscation. New ways to try to circumvent doing the right thing. What are some of the lessons that you draw from your experience that you would want people, legislators or advocates, addressing these same issues? What are some of the lessons that you would draw from that you would want to impart on people?
So, I would say, and it would be a responsible thing to say and a desirable thing to say that, when I look at the way that I approach things, I was new. I didn't have a lot of friends and allies in the body, and so I should have worked on making those friends and allies first before I tried to pursue certain bills. But I'm also very clear that it wasn't possible to do at the time.
Right.
There would be no allies, and I remember being told things like, when I said we have to have black ownership in slots and casino gambling, well, that's too radical. And I'm talking about by legislators from Baltimore that were in leadership over me, okay? I'm not talking about somebody from Western Maryland or the speaker. I'm talking about, that was the mentality. So it wasn't possible to do, I guess,
But you're saying now the environment may be different, where that would have been an approach for someone to
It would be.
now.
There's a younger, more progressive culture, especially in the House of Delegates, and I do feel that I have allies there in the House and the Senate now that I didn't have, and it wasn't possible to have then. And that's just with the turnover of the leadership. When I first got elected, again, 20 years ago, I was one of the youngest members. Now there's people way, now I'm an elder, right? So it was the older guard in particular, and they just weren't used to that. And that's also, we can't not talk about the fact that it wasn't just the agenda, although it was largely that. It was that I was a black woman, younger than most, and I didn't come in through any selection process or any endorsement process. I came in from a grassroots campaign, and thus I was independent of any obligations to anyone. I had no obligations to the Democratic Party.
And I think that point's really important. We probably should have discussed it earlier, like the way you came in, right? Because as you just said, you came in. You mentioned Robert Clay, who was a big part of you being able to get in, and because you got in not not as a result of the Democratic Party establishment's platform, in many ways, I imagine that was seen as threatening, and that impacted your experience and how you navigated the legislature.
I remember my first time meeting Delegate Maggie McIntosh, who was, now retired and, known as pretty much an icon in the legislature. The first thing she said to me, and again, I wasn't aware of what a phenomenon kind of, or an irregular thing it was for me to be elected without those endorsements and that support. And then I got a lot of votes. So Maggie was like, so how'd you get so many votes? I don't know. I ran. I have no idea, but I do know. I got a lot of votes because, one, I worked hard. And let's be clear, a lot of people run for office and they say they work hard, but working hard means really working hard. It means being in the street every day. It means, so in my very first campaign, there wasn't a morning when I wasn't either waving at traffic or going to the subway stations to give out the literature at Mondawmin and Cold Spring. Not a morning, right? And then that shift was over. There wasn't a time when we weren't, from whoever we met in the morning that was supportive, that we weren't hitting their lawns with the lawn signs, and recruiting more people to volunteer and work. And so my first campaign was a labor of love for the most part. At no point then or now have I ever raised a lot of money. I've always not raised as much money as other people, and that's always been a curiosity for the Democratic Party of how I can be so successful. Even this most recent election in July the 19th, I didn't spend a lot of money, and I don't have a lot of money, and I didn't really run a campaign, but I got a whole lot of votes. I know I was the only name on the ballot, but still, a lot of us were no senator in the city had a challenger, a real challenger. So I still got a lot of votes, and so I think at this point, and it is name recognition. People have been voting for me for a long time in the district, even though it's changed a little bit from redistricting. And I think also when I first got elected, it was not just that I worked hard. It was my story that people love a story. People loved my dad, or the idea of my dad. They loved my mom. They really loved her, for real. And they loved that I was a Baltimore born and raised person, and they knew my parents. That's what they like, the voters. Now we're talking 20 years later, so many of those people are dead. They're gone. But, I've been around for a long time. I would guess that still in 2022, a great number of people that shaded my name in don't know who I am. They don't know, they might vaguely know Walter Carter was her father. They don't know him. Some people think he was a minister. I hear that a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Or they have seen me on TV. They know snippets, but they don't know that whole story. But I feel like that story is what started me and got me elected that first time.
So going back to lessons real quick, one of the things that I feel like I learned acutely from you was how important it is to the Democratic Party to appear, to move policy that appears to address issues of Black people, but in terms of actually, substantively dealing with the issue. Like we talk about police accountability, where the legislature wanted to appear to do something, but in terms of actually, we talked a lot about community oversight. Like there's a desire to say that police accountability was addressed, but in terms of community oversight, there's just this reticence towards giving community power over law enforcement. So to me, that's one of the things that I feel like in thinking about newer legislators and advocates, for me, that's something that I know from just observing you, knowing to watch out for that. You want to say a little bit about that or experience you have?
I think that's true, and I think that we're going to be in a struggle for a long time. That the next real movement in the state and this country, in my opinion, on police reform, on real police reform, is really got to be giving the people power over the law enforcement. That's the next step. Like in this last season, the kind of stuff that we did, the release of police disciplinary records, the transparency, the accountability measures that are put into the new scheme in repealing and replacing the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. Those are the flavor of this season. But I think the next movement has got to be giving the people the power, and I do think that's going to happen. It's going to happen little by little, and it's going to happen little by little across the country. Maryland will not be a leader in that, clearly, but it'll take the next event, the next crisis, the next person that's deemed a voice on the expert on the issue to speak about how as long as police are policing themselves, you're never going to have real change, right? And then people will begin to embrace it, just like it took George Floyd for these things to happen when we knew that we had over 500 documented deaths in Maryland at the hands of police. We didn't care. We took George Floyd to do it. So I think also is another issue I know that you are interested in is the marijuana legalization. That's what you're going to see too. It's not an accident or a mistake that the legislature did not pass a licensing scheme or deal with real criminal justice reform in passing the bill to put the marijuana question on the ballot, the referendum for November. I have intense fear that it's going to be another major struggle to get real equity. I am not optimistic. I think that, all of these issues, though, what was lacking at the time that I first got elected and what has improved now but is not, to the level where it needs to be, is we got to be educated and organized as a people. You have your different, organizations that did a great job at coming together to collaborate on police reform. Hopefully there will be some of that on marijuana. But, from this past year, I don't think so, because everybody was all over the place. Nobody ever is divided. Until people of a singular agenda are organized and willing to use their influence and their power to demand these changes, they will never happen. And what I mean by that is, so take marijuana. There's there's always an exception. There are hardly any black person or white person or Latinx person or anywhere that if you said, do you believe that the people that have been most harmed by prohibition should now benefit from legalization and not rich white corporations? They'd all agree. But until there's an effort to organize around that issue and have people to agree, you know what? If we're not going to have this equity, we don't want it at all. Until you have that, you're not going to see the kind of changes. And I think isn't that the dilemma of the entire political system from the beginning of time until now?
Right. That's exactly right. And that's a pivot to one of the last things I want to discuss, which is kind of broader, but this is an example. We're on the Black Power Media platform. I know one of the conversations and debates that Dr. Jared Ball has a lot. He's really critical of the notion of buying power, and really the point of his argument, at least from my perspective, is that shouldn't trade off with the importance of political power, like the importance of really organizing for political power that will lead to all these other economic justice and all that. And I think we're in a moment now where some people who perceive themselves as radical will ignore or diminish, I think, the importance of the role of politics, right, in achieving political power as a necessary part. And I remember years ago, there was a panel we did. It was a long time ago. And I remember you raised that, where you were like, it's a lot of people in here that talk the radical talk, but if we're not organized and using the machinery of politics and political power, then how realistic is it that things will change very much? So essentially I want you to kind of give that pitch again, just in terms of, from your perspective, like, for those who see themselves as radical, those who see themselves as interested in black liberation, like really making the pitch as to why engagement with, because I think sometimes people confuse engagement with the political systems as like belief in America and its goodness and all that. So if you can demystify some of that, and make a case to people who see themselves as radical, why engagement in the political system is important.
Well, I get it. I get that people feel like the system doesn't pertain to me. It's never going to move forward in a way that's beneficial to my cause or my people or my existence. So why not? Why should I be bothered with it? But I think that my entire life and career, as we've talked about this time, is is the example. You know, I'm not happy with the progress or lack thereof that is being made in Maryland or the country. I don't believe that my party has my interest or the interest of my people at heart. But I know that if people like me are not there, we won't even get the progress that we have. Now, what would strengthen me and our cause in the system is to have a whole posse of people that are registered as Democrats that can have an impact in terms of being able to guide and influence policies with their vote, right? When you're not a Democrat and you say like, I don't give a damn about you, nobody cares, because you are not influencing whether they are in office or not, right? So what? Why should they care? Why should anyone care what you think when you don't influence their ability to be in power or not? And so that's the issue. But again, I always talk about light stuff, like not just shaping policy, because people don't see. It's difficult when they're involved in their individual daily lives to see how they have any extra time or energy to deal with what is going on in politics. But I do talk about all the time the little things, like you want to avail yourself of a scholarship. You want to avail yourself of the ability to even ask your legislator to, show up somewhere or do a citation or make a phone call on your behalf. If you're not engaged in the system, the chances you're going to get any real response is slim to none. Mm-hmm. Because frankly, when you're in elected office, you have an obligation to work on behalf of those people that have elected you. And that's registered voters who happen to be Democrats in my district. They come first. They come before everybody else, right? I might do something to help somebody else, but the people that have to get the majority of my attention are the people that put me there, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the lesson. Like, if you don't engage, then you really, people say, oh, if you don't vote, you can't complain. Our vote is not enough. And that's the education that we need as a people. Mm-hmm. Our vote, we need to start, people have talked for, a decade or more now about political literacy. No, financial literacy. We need political literacy. We need to be taught, because part of the problem in Maryland politics and in America is that we are not educated or conditioned in any way to understand our influence in politics. The fact that the people really do hold the power, but if the people don't use the power they hold, then, it's useless. And so we go through our educational system, we're educated to get our careers, we then are socialized and we're in sororities and fraternities, and we go to our churches and we do all of these things, and nowhere in any of that are we being educated about coming together and using the influence of our organization, our church, our sorority, our fraternity, our clubs, to use it to influence the politics of our community and the politics that governs our lives and the lives of our families. And so that's the big failing and I really think that's the key to change, is educating and organizing people around politics. And the reason, I think it's not a mistake. Like, it's not like, oh, we forgot to put that in the curriculum. Right. It's intentional.
Got it. All right. Well,
what if every non-voter in Baltimore City, in some of the all-black, most disinvested communities, had been a registered voter at the time that Martin O'Malley became the mayor, and then continued to perpetuate those oppressive policies? What if all of those people voted? He wouldn't have been possible. What he did wouldn't have been possible. So that's an example.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about something that just happened. We had a Democratic primary, primary of both parties, Republicans and Democrats. We have a Republican who's a Trump-backed Republican, Dan Cox, which is fairly unprecedented, in Maryland politics. And then we have Wes Moore, who's a political newcomer, who is the Democratic nominee. And one of the things I've openly said is that, it's hard to get a sense of, exactly where Wes is politically, given that he's a political newcomer. And typically in these kind of situations, especially just with the fact that Cox is a Trump-backed Republican, so there's much more urgency to make sure that he doesn't win. And so, some folks, they're different. I think that there are two different paths that West can take as a Democratic nominee, him and his campaign and the party, the Maryland Democratic Party. They can try to tack to the middle, right? Try to go for those like Hogan Democrats, right? Those Larry Hogan Democrats, those conservative Dems, which, would appeal to a wider, more suburban base. Or West and the party could take the approach of going deeper into the black community, addressing issues that directly impact black folks that may be traditionally disengaged. And one thing I don't think people know, I know a lot of people that worked on the Stacey Abrams campaign, and regardless of kind of where she is politically now, one of the key parts of her strategy that really set the stage for Georgia to go blue was registering new voters. I mean, as you know, typically the approach to campaigns is you focus on the people who voted and not people who have not. And what Stacey Abrams did in Georgia was a departure from that. And I think that particularly in this general, West and his campaign and the party, have it, and specifically in Maryland, 30% black, 11% Latinx. I don't know the numbers exactly, but the rank and file of the Democratic Party is our folks. So, of course, I think it would be obvious to anyone who knows, my work, that I would want him to go in the direction of our community and be directly addressing it, though that may be a liability for those Hogan Democrat types. So that's my sense of what the general is. You want to say a little bit about your sense of the general for governor in Maryland?
Sure. I'd like to just backtrack on what you talked about before about the party, though. And I want to just bring up the fact that, many people are excited because it looks like, we've got our first potentially black governor. But 8 years ago, the party decided to sit on its hands when it came to Anthony Brown and then blame Anthony Brown for not running a good organized campaign or being a good candidate or whatever. I want to go back to Martin O'Malley was about the most mediocre candidate you've ever seen. He has no real charisma, no real intellect, nothing. So the idea that when this black man comes along, the party couldn't do enough, offer that man enough support. There was no interest in the party. But at the time, we didn't have the opposition of a Dan Cox. We just had a regular old Republican, right? What they thought, like somebody they could live with.
Right.
And it is my belief, when you look at that, coupled with 4 years later with Ben Jealous, that nobody saw coming, who was the true progressive, the true person that came out of black struggle, the true person that articulated policies that were way to the left of the Maryland party. And you saw the party not just sit on their hands. Leadership, many of them actively supported Hogan. Mm-hmm. It showed you that the Maryland Democratic Party would prefer to have a Republican than a black person who was a progressive as well. Or in Anthony Brown's case, just a black person, mm-hmm. right? Now, here we are. They rejected the black man 8 years ago. Times have changed in the country. They rejected the progressive black man 4 years ago, but this time you didn't see them wait until now. You saw the leadership of this state embrace Wes Moore at the very beginning, and I think that he didn't articulate any policies, but he has the benefit of being likable. He has likability factor and a lot of charisma, and that's what everybody keeps talking about. But I think the other issue that Wes Moore had, that more so than Anthony Brown or Ben Jealous, is he had access to a lot of influx of money. And so without hesitation, much of our Democrat leadership endorsed him at the door. Mm-hmm. How do we influence which way they go? That's up to us. And what I mean by that is, so actually Obama also started that phenomenon with the registering new voters even before Stacey Abrams mm-hmm. on the national level. Right. I would hope that that's what we would do. Organizations, black organizations and black people and black leadership, it's up to us to use the opportunity, I think, to take the tact of getting black people involved. But let me, now that I think about it, I don't actually know that I have an answer to your question, because that whole idea about with this is kind of analogous, but not really. But with Martin Luther King, integrating his people into a burning house.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how, without really knowing what this agenda is going to be, I don't know how we really excite and invite young people, because I don't want young people to feel like they're getting burned. Mm-hmm. I don't want them to feel like, I don't want to lose people because we said, please, we need you to do this. You've got to do this. Our very survival depends on it. And then they do it. And then they're sorely disappointed. So the answer I can give is, I think that without a doubt, the administration is going to inure to the middle, because that's what the party is. And the party has a great deal of influence over what this campaign will be and what the future will be. It's not as much about the candidate as it is about the influence of the party. And that's, just if the party embraced a candidate and that's where the party is, that's where I think we're going to be. And guess what? The setup is almost perfect. And why I say that, you couldn't convince that many people that Hogan was like the Antichrist.
Right.
But they don't have to do anything, right? All they got to do is get the majority, because the majority is already Democrats, and then you add the independents that are not radical extremist to the right Republicans, we've already won, right? So there's no real need to do anything. And my fear is, this is not a good thing for progressive movement. It's not a good thing for progressive movement at all. Because now the deal is that we got to fight radical right-winger, right? So we're busy fighting the radical right-winger. Progressivism is going to get lost in the sauce. It's not a good, I don't think it's good for progressive for the next, for the immediate future.
Got you. All right, well, enjoyed having this conversation with you today. Again, this is Davon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, with Senator Joe Carter. See you all soon.